name is Rena Joseph. I'm the co-founder of Pera, and I will serve as your host for today. With me on the other side of the ocean in the United Kingdom is Stephen Isherwood. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Student Employers. Stephen, welcome.
Hi, Rena. Welcome, everybody.
Yeah, lovely. Stephen, I think ISE just finalized a very important and something that you repeatedly do, the student recruitment survey, which we will touch upon during our conversation. But please tell us first, what is your mission at ISE? Why did you join them in the first place?
So I lead the ISE. So we're a relatively small team. We're UK based, but we've got lots of contacts throughout the rest of the world. But our main remit is we're an employer-led organisation, or we've got lots of universities, lots of suppliers to the industry, and it's all about actually increasing understanding of the student labour market, helping employers understand what's happening in the graduate market, so that actually they can plan their recruitment, their development strategies, their attraction strategies much better, but also working closely with those in education and other players in the market to make sure that effectively we're transitioning students through education and into the world of work and everything to do with that.
No, that's a beautiful mission, right? To make sure that people actually find the right seat after they are graduated. With the audience, we like to keep things very interactive and make the session, of course, as useful as possible for you. So if you have any questions, you'll find the Q&A box, I think, down in your screen. So if you have any questions, please post them in this Q&A box and we'll touch upon them either during the conversation or at the end, so that we're sure that you actually get all your questions answered. Maybe a little bit about Pera, because many may not know us yet. And I think the mission that Stephen just highlighted very much connects with our mission and the reason why we partnered with ISE. So it's our mission to really take out human bias in decision-making and to identify true potential in young talents. I think the world and our companies need people that drive progress and find solutions for bigger challenges that the world is facing right now. Think of, sustainability issues, access to different resources. So in our work with leading companies, we found actually that great talent and potential sometimes literally looks differently than what you observe, with your bare eyes. So we're here to bring fair, efficient, and effective recruitment to you. And we will touch upon this topic today because why is this important and relevant? So let's dive into the details of the ISE report to actually discover why it is important. I think one of the key findings of your report, Stephen, states that there is a 17% increase of graduate hires over the last 12 months. Can you explain to us what are the key factors driving this increase? Why do we see this in the first place?
Sure. Yeah. So just in background to our report, those that aren't ISE members or may not have read it yet. Every year we produce an annual survey, which is our kind of benchmark data on the whole student recruitment hiring landscape. And this report came out in September, and our data showed that over that recruitment season, graduate hiring increased by 17%, just like the stat that you can see here. And that was driven by two things, to answer your question, Rena. One is the bounce back from the pandemic. So employers that couldn't recruit as many people as they wanted to because of all the restrictions due to COVID, they had urgent talent needs to fill. But also actually that long-term demand for early talent feeding employers' pipelines, shortage of talent in other bits of the labour market has seen that long-term, and I still think that will play out. We'll probably come on to this, how it will play out over the next sort of coming decade. Employers just needing to hire more people into their organisations, and employers very much seeing early talent as a talent pipeline to meet their resourcing needs in the future. So we saw vacancies bounce back to actually higher levels than they were pre-pandemic. So a really strong bounce back, and pretty much across all sectors, but the sectors you'd expect to see leading that growth, financial services, tech sector, consulting sector, but yeah, pretty much across the board.
Interesting. So I can imagine if you are a recruiter being confronted with this quite massive increase, how would you respond to this? Is there anything that the report outlines, like how are companies or recruiters responding to this huge increase in terms of applications? Stephen?
In terms of vacancies, yeah. So one of the challenges, of course, is that actually through the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic is the usual routes to market to become a little bit more fragmented. So actually employers not necessarily knowing where students are, because some are on campus, some were still at home, campus operating in a very different way. So I think for a lot of employers, it's been quite a challenge to actually get to where students are. And of course, when the market becomes much more competitive, there are a lot more vacancies out there. So there are lots of people vying for that student attention. So we've seen actually a lot more use of online platforms, of approaches to actually get to a broader range of students across a broader range of institutions. And actually lots of employers have told us that's been one of the positive outcomes over the last couple of years, is actually using platforms, using digital online tools to actually get to a broader number of students. And there's all sorts of different ways that employers can do that. But it has been a challenge, as any market, when the market bounces back this strongly, that's a lot of people recruiting, a lot of people trying to get students' attention. So actually students, I would say, during this period have had a bit more power in the market than they would have done previously.
Yeah, if we talk about bringing equity, right, to the market in terms of, at least it's something that we usually see with the companies that we work with. It's like, okay, it's not about only having the jobs, it's actually also about the talents, and the talents, how do we serve talents in a better way? And we'll touch upon it a little bit later, how we can do that, right? Particularly in this age of digitization, when you can reach people that maybe normally you wouldn't touch upon. I think another, maybe from that increase, I learned also from your research that there was a 33% drop on average in the number of applications, right, over the last 12 months. So we see an increase and we see a decrease. Why do we see this drop?
So I think there's two factors within that. One is that, yes, you have more vacancies, same number of students. Students are probably going to make less applications than they were relative to the number of vacancies than previously. So part of that is a function of more competition actually within the market. I also think there's a factor at play here, which is that students wanted to be students again. So as campuses opened up, the students were able to get back to students' life, something like what we considered as normal. Those students that had missed out on things like, Freshers Week, some of those social activities, actually they were keen to get involved in doing that again, and maybe actually the job hunting piece sort of went a bit further down the priority list. So I think we saw that kind of mixture of factors, a lot more vacancies in the jobs market, so more and more employers fighting for the same pool of candidates, and also students being more having other things to do apart from just doing the job search. And of course, remember, this is a drop based on the previous year. So if you go back to the previous year when we were in the pandemic, actually students were all at home. They couldn't go out, so actually they were, and also there's a lot more noise around the jobs market and the shortage of vacancies, because there was a drop in vacancies actually at the height of the pandemic. So students, of course, when that happens, can be more concerned about the jobs market, so likely to make more applications. So I think it's two forces. One is literally a function of the number of vacancies, and the other actually is students' attention being distracted, students having other things to do, and actually maybe being a bit less focused on the jobs market than they had been the year before.
Yeah, so if we, again, put ourselves in the shoes of graduate recruiters, what does it mean for them? Or maybe how can they deal with this?
Well, a bit like I said previously, it's a competitive market. So so good students, good candidates, again, they've had a bit more power in the market. So actually employers have had to work harder to engage those students, to find out where they are, use more data-led tools to actually target students a lot better. Obviously, a big increase in the use of social media in terms of targeting students. But I've even known employers getting a bit more on the ground. So actually, if students aren't necessarily hanging around campus, actually, is there marketing efforts that can be done in halls of accommodation? So I think it's about being innovative and using all sorts of different ways to get to students. And it's also about actually, when those vacancies fall, actually about working harder to keep that engagement with students. So the applications you do get, having a good approach to candidate care, managing the candidate life scale, making sure that they're engaged, so that also when you make those offers, they are more likely to join you when it comes to actually starting in the organization.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you touch upon. And maybe this is less applicable to the UK, but there's two things that we found in our research. One was speed in the process and personalization are extremely important. Why do you need to wait for certain feedback, if feedback comes at all, right? If it is personalized or not. And the second thing we found in a recent talents report is that companies that are selecting on competencies are actually able to extend their talent pool by 30%, opposed to those companies that selected based on resumes. And then what I mean by resumes is things like, your GPA score, whether you did an internship with the competitor or, the degree that you had from your university. So, and this was across Europe, so not particularly only for the UK. So it's also about what are we actually looking for in candidates, opposed to, what leads to success later on. From that drop, we go to a next nice finding. I think in the report, when being asked, right, about the next 5 years ahead, 53% of the employers expect an economic recession, which will make them recruit less over the coming years. However, what we've also seen before is that companies tend to fully stop their young talent programs for a while. Stephen, in your opinion, what might be different this time if we look at the data?
So the data that I've been talking about up to now has been on the recruitment season that sort of finished in the summer just gone. So that would be graduates typically starting their recruitment programs sort of September, October. We also asked employers actually what their plans are for the current recruitment season. So that's people they're hiring that will typically start in September 2023. Now there the figures were less strong. We're still predicting growth in the graduate market in the UK. So employers said vacancies should overall increase by roughly 2% in the graduate market. Much stronger growth for school leaver stroke apprentices, because that's also a strong source of early talent for the employers that we work with, and those vacancies were up by about 17%, but from a much smaller base. So the bulk of action is still in that graduate space. So at the moment, that's relatively still positive news despite all the economic headwinds we're facing. But my concern is that 2% growth actually at this stage in the cycle could turn into actually a reduction in vacancies as employers reassess their targets. And it's interesting talking to employers. A lot more are saying that they're taking a much more fluid approach this year in terms of target hiring, whereas employers that might have decided, round about sort of September time, right, that's how many we're recruiting, that's our target. Lots of employers saying, well, we're going to recruit to a certain number and then we'll see where we're at and do we recruit some more. So a more flexible approach to hiring through the cycle. So we'll have to see how this year pans out. I'm a bit concerned that, like I said, we might get into negative growth, but it's important to remember that even in the pandemic, 80% of graduate hiring still continued as normal. So that means actually most employers were still hiring significant numbers of young people. And I think that comes back to the longer term pressures, which are that when you look at changes in population demography, so when you look at actually what's happening about businesses' overall need for more and more high skilled talent, early talent actually needs to play an important part of that. So although we might have a relatively tricky year or possibly 2 years, I think in the long run that need for early talent will stay very strong. So I won't see necessarily employers pulling back significantly, because those employers that invest in this space know that if you stop recruiting now, in 3 years' time, when we're back into the growth phase, and actually businesses need people at those middle manager kinds of levels, if they turn the tap off now, they won't have them ready to do that work, and they won't be available in the market, or they'll be too expensive to hire.
Yeah, which is an interesting point you're touching upon, because it might be because companies are seeing in general, right, this recession coming, and there's pressure on cost, that the recruiters might be asked that run these graduate programs as well to reduce their investments. And I think you're touching upon the business case on the longer run, right? To say if you cut loose now, it will have an impact on the performance of your companies, in the long run, and build that business case basically towards your managers when being asked. Maybe if we go to the next tips and tricks, right? So if we prepare for 2023, there's basically, I think, 3 things that we want to highlight. Stephen, maybe you want to touch upon the first one, because if we look at fighting for your young talent case, you already touched upon this, but why is that important and crucial for companies?
Sure, yeah. So I think the primary reason is that piece that I mentioned earlier, which is that if you turn off your early talent hiring now, if you think about when those candidates start to become more productive in your organization, maybe they've done professional qualifications, maybe they've just got that grounding in training means that they can take on those early in career management roles. If you stopped hiring them now, as I said, in 3 years' time, when I've got a few grey hairs, so I've worked through more than one recession, so I'm pretty sure that the economy will bounce back. So yeah, you just haven't got that talent, which means that you can't do the work that you might be able to win. It can restrict business growth. And then also, if organizations think, well, I'll tell you what we'll do at that stage, we'll go out lateral hiring, we will go and hire that talent in the external marketplace. Actually, there's a real shortage for it. So often you can't find it at a more experienced level, or if you can, actually everybody is fighting for those candidates. So therefore, it's very expensive to hire. And if I go back to, so prior to taking on this role here at the ISE, I worked in professional services, and we definitely saw that where intakes have been cut back, that real challenge of trying to find people who can hit the ground running, perform well. There's also lots of evidence that early talent actually tends to produce the highest performers in an organization, because you have been able to train people into your culture, into your ways of working. Good training actually makes employees stay, retain, and grow with that organization. So you lose all that kind of talent piece. Yeah. The other challenge of stopping hiring now is that you lose your brand in the marketplace. And again, I have seen that previously in previous recessions. Employers stop recruiting. The student labour market has got a memory. Students talk to students coming through, and if that brand disappears, and particularly now that employers sort of recruit a bit earlier in the pipeline, doing work with first years, second years, if you stop doing that, again, when you try to turn the tap back on, actually you find your employer brand is very weak, and you have to overinvest to rebuild it.
Yeah, interesting that you've seen it in the past. I think one of the at Pera, we work with a lot of fast moving consumer brands, and the way they look at it, even in the short term, is that, this younger generation forms a large part of their consumer base. So basically the innovations, the products that they're inventing and that they want to bring forward to actually secure growth for the company in general is actually geared towards that particular consumer base. So if you don't have them in your team, how on earth are you going to, create products that actually matter? So even in the short term, there is a case to make to ensure that they are actually part of your talent pool. The second thing that we've seen is also that it's related usually to particular jobs where there's scarcity in the market anyway, like more technical, IT-driven, data science roles. And it takes a long time to actually upskill more senior staff instead of bringing in young talents that already, have at least the basic skills from university in that particular area. Yeah, so that's maybe to add to the fight for your young talent base. If we translate that to tips and tricks, which we tried to do prior to this conversation, Stephen and I, there's basically three things that we outline, right? I think one is measure the value of new hire talent. I think Stephen just touched upon this. If we look, there is evidence that clearly states, right, that young talent drives performance in organizations. So build that business case, basically feedback performance data to your hiring decisions and build that business case internally. I think the second thing that we've seen is that you need to optimize for cost efficiency in your current processes. If there is pressure on cost, make sure that you make it efficient. The problem with efficiency usually is that you don't want to see an impact on your quality, right? So how do we secure quality while making it more efficient? And one of the key things that we found in the companies that we work with, particularly in the UK, is that they actually kind of make the process much shorter without, again, compromising on quality. And the third thing is change your ideal candidate profile. Not only reflect what changes you need to make now, but it's also time to define how your future talent needs to look like, right? So broaden your entry requirements. We talked about this. Look for competencies, identify competencies rather than more simple requirements like what did someone study, what was his degree, what kind of extracurricular activities did someone do, so that you can shape the workforce of the future. Anything to add, Stephen, here in terms of the tips?
No, I think it's really understanding that the return on investment that investing in early talent brings to your organization, so that actually when you're looking at the amount of time you're investing, the processes that you put in place, it's really understanding that value that early talent brings. So you make sure you are identifying exactly what your organization, what success looks like, and making sure that your attraction and selection processes are matched to that.
Yeah. Let's move on to the second thing, the second trend that we see in terms of preparing for 2023, right? And that's keep engaging with students. So no matter what happens to your programs, we need to make sure that we keep engaging with students. Stephen, you already touched upon some of the best practices, but if you had to highlight another thing beyond the fact that you said, well, we see a fluid way of working. We also see more digitizations to connect through different platforms. Are there other things that come to mind through the survey that you ran and your experience with other companies?
I think the key thing is that long-term engagement. So one of the things that's changed in the time that I've been in this industry is that actually employers go much earlier in the recruitment cycle now. Employers used to focus on, when somebody was in the final year of their degree, that's when they do all their recruitment activities. They might recruit some interns as summer beforehand, but it was very much recruitment was loaded to that end of the cycle, whereas actually the forward-thinking employers are engaging with first-year students, second-year students. They have multiple ways for students to engage with the organizations. It might be, a work experience week. It might be some form of, online internship, work experience, case study type exercise, a whole range of different interactions there are that are out there. So it's about building that long-term employer brand, that long-term relationship. And I think the employers that don't do that, the challenge they have, of course, is that the employers that have done that, they've got all the best talent, you know, because they've built those relationships. So if you don't engage in that part of the candidate journey, actually you're separated from a whole bunch of talent that employers have already recruited and engaged with. So yeah, I do think it's that longer term piece, it's that continuous engagement, it's that flexible approach to working with students on their terms and where they are, so that you can build those long-term relationships with the candidates that you want to hire. I mean, again, all our data shows that people that are hired through intern programs, placement activities, they're more likely to accept job offers, and they tend to stay longer with an organisation and outperform. So there is a genuine return on investment of investing in that longer life cycle with students.
Yeah, so it's worth it, and at the same time you also advise to actually start engaging earlier, and not only in the last year when it comes to making a decision about where do you want to apply as a student, but actually even earlier on, and that there are creative ways to do it, right? We work with companies that run brainstorms globally where you have to find solutions for a brand challenge or a product challenge. So there's really creative ways to start engaging and already see how people are behaving early on in the process. Well, that leads maybe also to some tricks, tips and tricks regarding this particular element. I think the first tip that we came up with was to make your application form inclusive, to make it low barrier and stressless. I think, Stephen, you already mentioned earlier in another conference, reporting from a civil report, I think that 1 out of 4 candidates drops out because they're feeling stressed on an application process. And so how do we ensure that we make something that is personal, not generic, where there is stress in terms of I have to run this game and it takes me, you know, and somebody's watching me. So let's ensure that we take that out. And another thing that I learned from your presentation, Stephen, was that 27%, which kind of opened my mouth, drop out because of impersonal communication. So it's also about personalizing, and that's maybe also the second tip, right? How do we create a very simple yet personalized interface? Are all steps, tests, games, assessments really necessary, or can we do that in a different way? Still keeping the quality of the candidates, but give them personalized insights. I think one of the key things that we learned in the work that we did with some of the leading partners in the industry was, if you're a candidate and you go through this, how do you give something valuable back? If I take the effort, right, to apply and go through a certain process, can I give valuable information back on whether my competencies fit or not, where I could develop, right? So that even if I'm not being invited for a last round or a next round, that I have some information myself that is valuable to me to steer my career or to make a better career decision. So we see these kind of things coming back. And I think the third thing is treat candidates as you would treat your customers. Like I said, give relevant information back to candidates in a timely manner, soften the disappointment of rejection, make sure that you can actually explain that rejection without sending, you know, a generic email like, thank you, we'll keep you in our database, and we'll see you another time, right? So why am I not invited to an interview? Make sure that you actually explain that. Other things, Stephen, amongst these 3 tips?
Yeah, I think it's the obviously it's the employers that graduate recruitment tends to be a volume process. It just is that's the nature of the beast. And the larger your brand and the larger number of vacancies, and the more employers the more candidates, of course, that you have to get through a selection process. So for me, it's balancing that need to have an efficient volume process, but absolutely also has that personalized touch, and that balance will be different for every organization. So it is really thinking about your candidate journey, understanding that you are in a competitive market for good talent, and actually, and good students do have a choice about which employers that they will go to. You know, we've seen renege rates increase. That's in, you know, students who reject an offer after it's been made and they've accepted it. So it's important to get that balance right, and making sure you are investing in that candidate journey, and also understanding that students are a lot more time poor than they used to be. We're in a cost of living crisis. More and more students are having to work, you know, to pay their way through university. So it's fair to say they probably have less time than they did, you know, a few years ago to engage in application forms and processes. So it's getting that balance right between efficiencies, candidate journey, and making the right level of investment for your organization.
Yeah. I wanted to touch upon one of the things you just mentioned about, you know, that there is a volume process going on, and at the same time, candidates, at least at the moment, have, you know, multiple options. So one of the key things that we've seen is actually, how do we turn it around? How do we give candidates or applicants, right, valuable information about whether your company fits them, fits their skills, fits their competencies early on in the process? So it's almost like, you know, as a company, you're applying to that particular candidate. You know, let's turn it a little bit around. And the other thing is that, looking at this particular thing about stress and stressless, we're focused on running digital interviews, asking people 3 open-ended questions, which is personalized, because these open questions would be, you know, Stephen, you would answer them differently than me, because we have had different experiences in life. And at the same time, if we can then give them back some valid information about whether they have the competencies that drive success in an organization or it doesn't, and we can give them info if it doesn't, what would fit them, yeah, then people will keep a positive, even if I'm not being hired, thinking about volume, and you can't hire everyone. Even if I'm then rejected, I still remember and have a positive brand experience, you know, with the company. So those are some of our tips. I think we move on to the last bit of, you know, 2023, which is something very close to my heart. I think, Stephen, you mentioned pay even closer attention to diverse talent, right? So the socioeconomic background is the thread that joins all of other IDA activities together, especially in economically uncertain times. And students from more vulnerable backgrounds are more likely to be affected by these market dynamics. Yeah? So negative news, they might actually be more likely not to apply for jobs. So how can we make sure that we're even closer to them, Stephen, and to listen to their needs and support their career continuation?
Yes, I think that has been evidence again from previous recessions, which is that that when negative headlines start to come out saying that the job market's tight, there are fewer vacancies, the market's tougher for students. Actually, sometimes students think, well, actually, the market's so bad, there's no point in me applying for jobs. And it's interesting, in previous recessions, we've had employers who have not filled all their vacancies. So it's important to keep, as we said, communicating with students when you are recruiting, because you can sometimes find students disengaged, particularly those from backgrounds whereby they haven't got necessarily parents who might have been through the same selection process, or their peer group may not understand the market. So actually they haven't got those support mechanisms to say, well, actually, this is what happens. You might need to make more applications. You might get rejected more, or actually this is where you need to look a little bit harder maybe for roles. So keep communicating. That's important. And also, again, one of the great things I think as a result from the pandemic, one of the positives, amongst all the gloom, is that actually, yes, everybody has become more digitized and being able to use more online platforms. So a lot of the employers I talk to say they now work with a much broader range of universities because there are more online platforms that where students are. So actually, they're not restrained in the same way they may have been pre-pandemic with that resource needed to actually go onto campus and do activities. But also it's understanding where that diverse talent is. So are there student societies you can work with? Are there departments within a university that are looking at widening participation? Students are first generation to university. Can you work with those to target those students? And also really looking at your selection process, understanding the metrics, looking at where people fall out. Are everybody from all groups, genders getting through the same stages in equal amounts, or have you got something that may indicate you've got some bias in your process? So it's that all aspects of your recruitment lifestyle, it's making you pay close attention to diverse talent, and then when they join, actually making sure they stay, because also I think employers are waking up to the fact that actually they might do a good job in recruitment, but then actually for whatever reason, cultural reasons, and within the organization, actually 2 or 3 years down the line, those students may not have stayed. So it's thinking about that part of the life cycle as well.
Yeah, then we have very diverse talent, but we're not very inclusive. And then people leave again. So that's extremely important. I think if we move to the tips, right, if we talk about to boost your D&I program, I think from our research, we have evidence that diverse talent pools, when we look at things like ethnicity, gender, background, where people come from, what they studied in the past, we do see that it has a huge impact, usually across the board, and we measure that across, the past 7 years that we work with organizations. We've actually looked at how does diversity correlate with actual performance and output, and we found that across the board it's 30% higher, so higher performance compared to previous years when they had less diverse groups. So there is a true business case actually to ensure that you engage with very diverse groups. So strengthen your collaboration with colleges and universities, and particularly, I would say, in these specific groups, because again, from the research, we see that they might drop off earlier or be more hesitant at the moment that there is negative news coming in to actually be convinced to apply. Also, make sure that you tune your communication to attract this diverse workforce, right? So we're in the business of language use. We analyze how people answer certain questions and how those answers relate to competencies that are seen in successful employees after being hired in the organization. So your communication, your language matters. So you have to adapt your language, the way you communicate on a micro level with these minority groups, and create a space where they can be themselves when they're in. So I think that's super, super important. And that's something that where we've seen where the leaders in the industry actually differentiate from the laggers behind, that are lagging behind. And then the third thing is choose the right tools for bias-free hiring. Truly inclusive, yet personalized, right? So you have to avoid cognitive and overly rational assignments, make sure that they are not discriminative, and that they are actually identifying those true skills that matter, rather than anything else, the chances, opportunities they had in the past, that shouldn't matter. So look very carefully at what kind of tools you're using, because sometimes they might be very efficient, but not per se bias-free. I think we're at the end of our tips and tricks. So we have some nice time for some Q&A and curated Q&A. So please use the Q&A. I think there's some that were already there. Stephen, I think one question is, with the recession on the horizon and less recruitment expected, do you see a change in the use of selection and assessment tools?
Not necessarily related to the recession, I don't think. No, I think I think one of the challenges is when you have a recession is the pressure on cost basis for recruiters. And that means that actually sometimes recruiters don't have the money to invest in that constant needing to upgrade systems and keep pace with changes in the market and technology, because budgets get frozen. So I think that tends to be one of the challenges. And again, it's those organizations that keep investing and keep thinking about the long term that are the ones that come out of recessions much more powerfully. But I never see recessions directly think people, right, we're going to change our recruitment process because of X. Changes tend to be driven by cost bases in my experience.
Yeah, and it comes back again to building that business case. I think there's enough evidence also that we can share from companies that actually shows things that you also mentioned, Stephen, like the impact on progress, on innovation, on performance of companies, right? And if we're not investing in the right tools to help us, well, once again, you might as a recruiter be overloaded because you still have to do the work, right? The volume doesn't go away. That's the problem. So if we care also about our colleagues, let's make sure that we also get some investment from our managers. I think another question is, can you further explain the difference between selection on competencies and the CV process? How do you best measure competencies? How do I know which matter most? Maybe I can take that question first. I think in the research that we've been doing, we actually started to understand first, what are competencies that we see in people that we work with? So if we look at post-hiring performance data, it's much easier when we work together to know, well, I need to be with Stephen for organizational excellence, and maybe Rena is a team player. So once we have, and usually we measure these in 360s once people are hired in organizations, if we have that data, and we have also performance data, for example, number of innovations, client feedback, chargeability, revenue contribution, things that we can measure, we can run analysis across what competencies actually matter, correlate with actual output. And then we can translate that back to our hiring decisions. So are we actually, assessing for the right competencies at all? What are we missing in our organization? So if we bring back data from inside to the recruitment side, we can actually be far more relevant. And the other thing is, information in resumes, also scientifically, we know that there is very limited correlation between CV metrics and job performance. So if we have methods that we can use to identify these competencies early in a process, and we can get rid of things in a resume, then we're far better off, right? And that's something that we have been working on in our work and research. Stephen, another question. What do you suggest as new developments in setting up a modern candidate selection process?
Sorry, can you read the question? I didn't quite understand it.
Yeah, sorry. One question in the chat is, what do you suggest as new developments in setting up a modern candidate selection process?
So I think there's all sorts of innovations coming into the market. There always are. This is, it's a vibrant, competitive market for employers with new entrants, with new solutions. But I think one of the overall changes over the last definitely over the last decade is actually the amount of testing or tools put up front in the selection process as everything has moved online. And we've also seen employers actually rely less on academic credentials. I mean, the UK has always had a very low emphasis placed on the subject studied, but actually employers did have things like, you know, GPA or a degree classification or high school grades coming through, and employers are playing less reliance on that as they're able to put more testing up front. So I think that's the change, and those tests being much more relevant to the role and thinking about, as we've discussed earlier on this webinar, actually what good performance looks like in an organization. So I think it's that understanding what your organization is and mapping that process to that success in the organization, but it is more use of tools used up front and getting more sophisticated rather than just relying traditionally on an application form, you know, an interview and assessment center. It's lots of other techniques being used in those processes and using data to drive those efficiencies in that process.
Yeah, I think a recruiter nowadays has to be like an occupational psychologist, a data scientist, and a business person, right? So our role is also changing in that perspective. Stephen, also the ISE survey was done amongst employers. Is a question. Has it been researched what the top expectations from graduate applicants are in the recruitment process? So what
yeah, so we do recruit employers, and our annual survey has detail on the kind of skills and competencies that employers are looking for, and also actually what they think students are more likely to have in terms of those skills, and actually where they might be falling short and need more work that feeds into the development program. So our report that's available for members has a lot of that detail. But in summary, for us, it's getting over that importance of those non-technical skills. So that is that ability to work well with other people, to, you know, take an analytical problem-solving approach to your work. And also, and I think this is becoming more important, being able to be self-aware, self-reflective, be able to manage your development, manage your careers, as I think there's so much uncertainty in the future of work. The pace of change is so much quicker. I think it's about, you know, what are your skills and attributes that help you manage and deal with that change that's coming down the pipeline, and less reliance on necessarily being recruited for those technical skills. So that's what we see very much in the marketplace. I think the other thing I'll say is it can be a bit difficult for students, and that's because every employer has its own languages of skills, attributes that it's looking for. Broadly, they say the same things, but it's using different words. So I think it's being mindful of actually explaining those to students in language that they understand.
Yeah, that they understand. And I think secondly is also what we found. We've run now 4.5 million digital interviews globally with young potential. And if we look at their feedback, I think one of the key things is, again, valuable information of what competencies I have, but also how they matter to certain roles. So that's one thing. And the other thing we found is that, coming back to that stress level, personalization in the process is extremely important. And that's also where the friction steps in, because usually we think personalization has to do with, I have to talk to a human, which is not necessarily the case, right? When we talk about personalization, it's about, do I give data back, information back that is geared towards me, Rena, rather than you, Stephen? That might be different. So how do I cater for that? And there's ways to do that. So that's basically what I wanted to add. Another question that came from the audience is, what is your definition of bias-free hiring? Stephen.
Well, I would say any selection process that doesn't have bias in it. That's I mean, that's the obvious one. So, and I think the way to test that, as I said earlier, is by looking at your selection process, looking at actually, firstly, who's applying and what benchmarks are you using. So, for example, if I take gender in the UK, about 54% of UK undergraduate students are female. So if your application pool doesn't reflect that, then you know, you're not reflecting the student demographics. But then it might be different by subject. So actually, if you were talking about engineering students, well, less than 20% of engineering students are female. So it's understanding your benchmarks to know what your market is, and then what's happening to that application pool. But then it's tracking them through the process. So one of the things that we found that was quite interesting a few years ago, the last time we looked at this, was that female students were more likely to actually get through the selection process and get a job offer than their male counterparts, but they were less likely to apply. So that said to me that actually there wasn't bias in the process, but actually there was something about the appeal of particular programs and organizations. So yeah, so bias free for me is understanding actually the demographics of your talent pool and seeing who does or doesn't get through the process, and using data to understand any of those anomalies. That's normally a pretty good indicator.
Yeah, and I think on our side, if we look at bias is usually, you know, people are usually selecting people that are like themselves, right? So we have confirmation biases. There's different type of biases that exist when we're selecting candidates. And the question is, how can we also, usually what I've seen over the 15 years working with companies is that you can either run a very structured interview process, but that takes a lot of resources, because it means that you need at least 3 people. You have defined beforehand what you're going to assess for. You do that individually, the 3 people, then you bring back that data, and then you define who goes to the next round. Usually that doesn't happen. People just, and particularly hiring managers in the last step, just start a conversation. So how do we actually avoid that particular bias, right? And that we have data that confirms what do we look for in people? What kind, again, not what have you studied, etc., but what competencies are important in the success in our organization? And can we then use that to apply in the hiring process? So it's not about whether I have a certain, and we've seen that in the past, we had companies that looked at videos of candidates, literally, and they were, and when we looked later at the data, we found that people that had a certain English accent were prioritized over other candidates. So biases step in, particularly if we look at video, things like names in application forms, etc. So how do we find tools that actually take that out? Do you have examples of how to make communication to students and candidates? Do you have examples of how to make comms to students to attract a diverse workforce? So how should we communicate to diverse groups of students?
So my answer to that would be I mean, I'm not a comms expert, so I don't run a recruitment media agency, but it's understanding your audience. And it was interesting, we did a conference yesterday for careers professionals, and one of the interesting things that I picked up was actually using students themselves to drive social media campaigns and social media messaging, and actually having those relatively lightly managed by an organization, so that actually the messaging doesn't become overly corporately constrained. So I think it's understanding your audience and actually knowing where your audience is, and using the language that audience understands. It's addressing the messages that audience wants to hear and needs to know. So I think it really is about knowing your audience, rather than taking a corporate communications approach to this. I know that can be a challenge internally, because often corporate comms and recruitment comms are fighting each other a little bit. But it's that really understanding your target market and being able to communicate. And I do think that using students, your own graduates within your organization to lead that messaging is really important.
Yeah, very good point. The last 2 questions, because we have 5 minutes left. Time flies when you're having fun. Stephen, recruiters feel stress in providing feedback. What could be an effective solution to this, so that the talent could receive constructive feedback and improve upon their next applications?
I think it's different. Obviously, I know, Rena, with your tools, you'd have something to say around how that can be automated. So I think that is important. I mean, I think it's a challenge because of the volume of hiring that happens in early talent and just the logistics of giving individual feedback. If you've got 10 to 20,000 applications for your program, which I know some employers do, but I think it's important not to be afraid of it, and important to understand that actually students are asking for feedback. I know of some employers that offer one-to-one feedback for anybody who gets through to the assessment centre stage. So I think that's really important, and being comfortable. And if your selection processes are robust and collates good information on students, then it should be relatively clear why candidates don't get through. But remember, students who you say no to are your employer brand. So I think sometimes we forget about all the students that are rejected, because those students are out there talking to other students, talking about your organisation and the experience that they had. And I think sometimes we forget about that kind of that piece, and sometimes organizations can be guilty of running what effectively are rejection machines, not recruitment machines. So it is difficult, but it's having the data to feedback, it's having the tools and systems that can do it, and remembering that actually there is a positive benefit to students who might say, well, do you know what, organization X, I didn't get through, I wish I did, but I understand why I didn't get through. I respect that decision, and maybe I'll come back in a year's time, or I'll definitely talk, in a positive light about it to my friends and colleagues on campus.
Yeah, it's very good. I think one of the key things that we give as feedback is actually, what are your strong competencies and how do they matter to the particular job or the particular role or the situation, the use case that you're applying to. And again, then you can give them also advice on what types of roles might fit their competency profile very early on in the process. Again, valid feedback. And then if there is time for recruiters to actually explain that, then you have a more valuable conversation, right, with them. Which is data backed. Last question, 27% of students have experienced depression during the pandemic. How can we reduce stress throughout the recruitment process for them?
It's interesting, this one on stress in the selection process, because again, I think it's about balance. It's about explaining to students what it is you're looking for, how they will be tested by whatever elements are in your process. There'll always be some stress in the process, as in there's always stress in work. So you can't make things stress-free. It's a recruitment selection process. But I think it's about the right level of stress, and not actually making candidates feel like maybe they're being tricked in some way, or they're having something sort of sprung on them that seems unfair and unreasonable. So I think for me, it's explaining actually why you have a selection process and being really clear on what you're looking for and what those competencies are you're looking for. I think sometimes recruiters are a bit afraid of giving out too much information because they think candidates will game the system. They'll only give the answers. And if you have a good, robust process, good tools, well-trained assessors, actually you can genuinely spot the authentic candidate. If I go back to my previous career previous to this role, we built a process that was very much around authenticity. So I think for those students, it's about it's about being really clear on the process, what you're looking for, why you're expecting candidates to do what they're doing. Then if people understand that, then actually they should make better candidates for you, which is a good thing. But also they're clear and reasonably stressed or less stressed about the process.
And also measure that, right? You can also ask students how they feel about a certain process so that you can learn from it later on, which is something that we also recommend. The time is up. I think we had a wonderful conversation. For the audience, what topic would you like to see next? You can still drop a message. I think, there's a poll even about it. So please let us know what topic is most relevant to you to further deepen how to handle candidate anxiety, D&I, AI in recruitment, assessments in recruitment, a blessing or a curse, or is candidate screening human-led or tech-led? Let us know what you prefer, and we'll make it happen. Stephen, I like to thank you for all your beautiful insights, your personal experience, and of course the data that you collected with ISC. Thank you all for listening in, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Great. Thank you, Rena. Great conversation. Everybody enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.